the polling shows that a majority of people seemingly want to break away with the centrism of the Democratic Party. But as I think Bauer just clearly illustrated, because the Democratic Party is part of the propertied classes, it is not a liberatory. I don't need to say this. This regrettable century. I don't need to say this. Because it is a propertied party and serves the interest of property owners, people are just resulting into quietists, into people who are just politically indifferent, who just think that there is no power to storm heaven. There's nothing to do. They can't will anything out of it because they all work 3 jobs, and
we're all involved in varying levels with an activist milieu of individuals who are just not committed to power and any exercise of power. So we're not involved in our workplaces as a party. We're not involved in our neighborhoods as a party. We are involved in a demonstration against school cuts called by the Democratic Party. And we're involved in that demonstration as members of our own organization, advertising ourselves as part of this constituent element of this effort by the Democratic Party, because we're not even interested in exercising power, let alone contesting for political power.
This is also fundamentally why I have such a problem with Brenner's political capitalism, or whatever thesis, that kind of relies on the current existing social political model. I'm not going to go too deep into this. Is a turnout-based model, when it's like if you look at any of the turnout rates from like 1789 to today, we're actually at like very historical lows compared to even like the mid-century of the 20th century and everything. Even though we had like one election that was slightly higher and had like more people than ever who voted, we had a smaller percentage of the population that voted than like 1860. And so it's not a turnout-based model. It's clearly not a turnout-based model. In fact, it's probably a repression model. Like all political politics at this point is to repress the other political turnout.
Right.
And this is like a race to
I think indifference is like one of the key words you use. Like there is like, I don't know, indifference is useful for a lot of the ruling class right now.
Right.
Yeah.
To return to the book, though, on page 447, Bauer says, but even before the new conditions of the proletarian struggle could change the relationship of the working class masses to the state, they had already altered the relationship of social democracy to the power struggles of the nation. The initial form assumed by political revisionism in Austria is that of national revisionism. Although national revisionism is still not embodied in a group within the party, it is already exerting its effect as one of the orientations of will that will wrestle with one another in the consciousness of the individual representatives of the Austrian proletariat. And this is another reason why I do feel like we are in the second stage. I'm going to keep arguing this point. Is I do think the reviving of the national question and the lively debate and discourse on it, I do think points towards a void core that might not exist in form, but does seem to like exist in its absence of this stage, of this mode, as national questions are being asked. Is this what the social democratic movement should be doing? Do we need, I mean, even the fact that right now within the DSA there seems to be a lively debate on black nationalism, which I think is a debate that should be had within these political forms and what that means. I think is pointing towards this, but I don't know. I could be fucking stupid.
I think the bringing up national, because when political revisionism got brought up earlier, like my brain just kind of defaults to like Bernstein revisionism, which, I mean, I guess there's a national element of like, I don't know, supporting the German state during World War I or whatever. But I wouldn't necessarily call like Bernstein revisionism national revisionism. So is it more like nowadays you feel like you're seeing like that the national question is being asked, but it's kind of this like that because it's not tied to any like class politics or analysis, that it's kind of tends to be this more like vacuous form that it emerges in.
Well, I think Bauer is careful to say that and he does say this. I might just like do a long quote, but first I'll answer it. I think he's careful to say that national revisionism is not initially like this bad. Like I don't think we're in like good or bad territory.
Yeah.
He's saying it's a natural outcome of a certain type of political revisionism that happens.
Mhm.
He says on 448, national revisionism initially appears within the social democratic movements of the formerly non-historical nations. Here it attaches itself to the naive nationalism that has dominated the mood of the young proletariats of these nations. It gains strength due to the fact that the nations that are still composed exclusively or predominantly of oppressed and exploited classes are deprived of important national rights. He then goes on to say that national revisionism also gradually penetrates the proletariat of the old historical nations. Here it attaches itself to the spontaneous hatred of the German worker for the foreigner who depresses wages and breaks strikes. This hatred is nourished by bourgeois elements, in particular by influential intellectuals who have developed from proponents of bourgeois democracy into proponents of proletarian democracy. But its most powerful driving force is the reaction against the revisionist politics of the social democracy of the non-historical nations. So I think Bauer's like saying this like national revisionism is in this state of coalition building or political revisionism is going to appear because these he says non-historical nations in this. I was reading it more as he's describing a marginalized nation more than necessarily a non-historical. He seems to be like using them interchangeably in a problematic way sometimes, but in that like these historically marginalized nations in this sense are not seeing their needs met by this kind of like political revisionism, by this coalition building, if that answers your question.
So is third worldism the negative like reverse image of national revisionism?
I don't know. I feel like this is an open question that I think they're like in the same way that there are vulgar forms of everything. And I think we pointed to this last, I think you can very clearly point to the vulgar forms and be like, yes, this.
Right.
And I think this is why it's important that I don't think we're in like the good bad territory at this point, but we're like, this is an outcome of these needs not being met, of this oppression continuing.
Well, okay, but I want to sound like a big brain smarty pants, and I want to point at those dummies over there who believe the wrong thing, you know.
Well, what are you like? I think this is my question. Is like, are we defining?
Just fucking around.
I know.
Well, as Bauer says on the page before, neither of these tendencies can die at this stage of capitalist development. Revisionism repeatedly emerges in a different form and is repeatedly defeated by intransigence. In the struggle between two tendencies and the fluctuating tactics of the party, the conflict is expressed between the conditions of the utilization of power and the conditions of the constitution of power of a proletarian party and a capitalist state, a conflict that is ultimately rooted in the fact that the working class must live in a capitalist state and nevertheless finds it intolerable. Which then leads us into the third stage of capitalist development, which is that that's when the proletariat already forms the overwhelming majority of the population, and the conquest of political power by the proletariat already appears to the propertied classes to be an imminent danger. I skipped a few lines in my highlighting of this, so I'll just end by saying here the political and socio-pedagogical activities once again coincide, and this stage of the class struggle ends with the conquest of political power by the working class. So I think this really drives home Brandon's point of how it's more of just a constant movement through the conditions that have been handed to the proletariat in capitalist countries. That in order to necessarily get to what Bauer views as the positive end goal of the proletariat seizing political power, which is something which I think we can all universally agree upon. You're going to just necessarily move through some of these revisionist tendencies because that's how you're going to get to the more fleshed out version of what you're getting to. It's like when you're going through any kind of class and you're given like the very introductory theories, and then you're like, okay, well, here's the later theories that are integrating multiple of these perspectives and whatnot. you need to be introduced to some like early reductionisms in order to grasp the fuller picture that can be presented once you figure out a way to meld these things together, which is something we've been loosely talking about. There's a lot of questions on the socialist horizons that have not had the possibility to be answered, but only when they are answered will we have the ability to go further than our ancestral socialists were able to before.
This is also to bring up a friend of the pod, Varn. A thing that he has talked about often is that we seem to be going through these cycles faster and faster. These cycles of like predominance of like a particular like political thought, and then moving through it. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it that much, but that popped up in my mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good thing to kind of talk about, even just like glancingly, because it's obvious that I think we have blind spots. And I think that that's something we said at the beginning of this episode, that Bauer in particular is discussing things which in these speed runs of political history, these various LARPings, one might say, that people aren't LARPing the Austro-Marxists, right? They're LARPing the Bolsheviks. And it's useful. I think, right? Because you're at least trying something, you know. But if you just keep rehashing those same things, you're not getting anywhere. Perhaps you should look at some of these more obscure cases that were dismantled or destroyed, like the Austro-Marxists, like the too often discussed by me Indonesian Communist Party, and by some of these other groups and theorists that often don't get talked about across the left, whose questions go unanswered to this day.
This actually leads really well back to the text on page 453, and then a note that I had. Bauer says, however, just as political revisionism is irredactable in the second stage of capitalist development and has to be repeatedly conquered anew by intransigent revolutionary tactics, so too in Austria at this developmental stage, national revisionism cannot die as long as national autonomy has not been realized. The conflict between national revisionism and the international tactics of principle arises from the fact that the working class is subjected to the centralist atomist state, constitution, and yet finds it intolerable. It is thus up to the representatives of the tactics of principle to be at every moment numerous and energetic enough to prevent national revisionist aspirations from destroying the proletarian movement. And the note that I had here is that given the fact that this didn't succeed, I think the open question here is this a doomed strategy? Will the United States and any socialist movement which tries to push back national revisionism be doomed to only see the collapse of the United States as an entity in the same way the Austrian-Hungarian Empire as a multinational state collapsed? Or is there a way for this sort of strategy to succeed in a way that it did not in Austria?
Yeah, I do think, because I do think the point about like these underdeveloped like ideas about that correspond with national revisionism or whatever are like, it is necessary that in the process of like trying to build a different world that we fail at first, like, and like in that sense, like, I don't know, Luxemburg's right, like you will have these premature attempts and like there will be this failure in these early stages. And if you look at grand historical changes, like that's what happens in transition between various social forms and whatnot. But I do think that once again, there can be this too fastness where you go from like, yes, that initial failure, that initial vulgarization is like a stage you have to pass through, to where you get to like that Beckett line where it's just like fail again and fail better. And then it just kind of is like, oh, we're just going to fail in this cycle. And like, hopefully at the end, we get to, we fail better so that it's qualitatively better. Like, I don't know. I think that's like, do we need to fail better than what Bauer was aiming at here? Or do we have to like have a different like measure and aim? But once again, like, yeah, you do have to have that moment of failure, like the symptoms of like historical development of like that, like you have to pass through those stages. Like you have to have inadequate ideas at first, and then you have to develop the adequacy of those ideas and like, develop your knowledge of the actual causes of the like things that you experience in like your historical and political existence. But I don't know. Like, I guess that's just something I always, and if I'm going to be critical about a lot of like second international era Marxists, is like there tends to be a sort of too fastness on like certain things when it comes to like how we get from here to there. But also that might be an inevitable process or an inevitable factor of like when you're writing in that situation. Like this, you know, it's also expecting a lot from a fucking writer.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, to be fair, I mean, they were expecting a revolution right on the horizon, and then a revolution came.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Second International was correct in its assumption that they were on the cusp of revolution. They were just wrong in that they would be the people who did it because they all joined together in World War One and or split against each other in World War One.
Well, I mean, every Marxist going back for decades before World War One, every single one predicted the coming great war of the inter-imperial rivalries, and they were preparing for it and waiting for it to happen, and they all were predicting that to be the working classes moment to rise up and join together internationally and carry history forward in that moment. I think the greatest lesson that we have to take in looking back is, you know, despite that knowledge and despite that preparing for that moment, how disastrously failed nearly every one of the European social democratic parties were in responding to it, and responding to it predominantly by siding with their own national bourgeoisie in a moment of nationalist fervor. That was largely for electoral purposes of like saving themselves, because the working classes that voted them into office were taken by their own national fervor. So this question of this national question, I think, is absolutely crucial to figuring out and getting right to be able to prevent that great debilitating moment from recurring.
Well, and I think especially when we're looking at what Bauer is talking about with the nation here, well, like when we're talking about, World War I happened, and you have all these great revolutions, great world, upheaval, changes and whatnot, but there wasn't one big revolution where we just figured out the path towards socialism. And like that is like, this is why Zizek always makes that joke about how he would sell his mother into slavery if he got to see V for Vendetta Part 2, which is about the day after the revolution. I think like when it comes to like the development of national culture, like I do think it is like, how do you develop culture beyond these great these great moments of rupture? How do you have this continual, path of development forward? Which also is, I imagine, what Jason wants to get out of his whole podcast that he's doing on the Soviet Union right now. And I do think national culture is a huge question in that, because especially in how Bauer develops the concept, it is just this coherent, it's like this holistic space, cultural space into which you develop and become this well-rounded human being that ostensibly in our socialist future we want to develop people. It is a necessary integral part of that I think especially has to do with the process of socialist construction after the revolution, for sure.
I want to add one comment about the failure of social democracy in the lead up to and in the initial moments of the First World War, because like you said, they were correctly predicting it happening for a very, very long time. And I think what was the problem is that the development of social democracy from minor to major, from small amounts of influence to hegemonic amounts of influence, led them to fundamentally misunderstand revolution. So like
Right.
when the war happened, they're like, well, we're going to lose our influence over the working class if we don't go along with it. Once the war's over, then we can get back to the business of slowly building influence and hegemony in this linear fashion. Misunderstanding what evolution is, misunderstanding the dialectics of social transformation. So really fundamentally, that is the actual question, is like, are we prepared to, or are we thinking about things in such ways to be prepared to do things in entirely different ways if ever the moment the opportunity comes? Or will we be faced with something like World War as an interruption into our otherwise slow plodding forward on this linear trajectory, which doesn't exist?